Welcome to Series 3 of Tips for Existence, or rather an anthology of some of our favourite conversations that we had on Series 3. And if you're not already a Patreon supporter, if you support us via Patreon, so that's just patreon.com/cosmic shambles, then you can hear the entirety of these episodes. And after this, by the way, we start immediately with Series 4, of course, where we talk to Apollo 9's Rusty Schweickart. But we talked to someone else who always wanted to be an astronaut, but unlike Rusty, hasn't achieved it as yet. She might. Katy Brand. And we talked a little bit about how her career has been a solo adventure for her.
I think that's true. And I think that sort of saved me a little bit, and has at various points, that I do always feel like I am on my own adventure. I didn't feel that necessarily, or didn't understand that properly when I was 13, 14, 15. Obviously, you're just consumed with hormones and whatever, and then I laid a load of religious whackery on top of it, just for good measure, you know, and plus did all the other hobby. I was always busy. I mean, it was relentless. I didn't really have time to sit and think. But yeah, I think what I have now learned more and embraced and been happier for it actually is that my life isn't sort of chaotic or unpredictable or crazy. I'm just sort of on a bit of an adventure, and as long as I have myself with me, then it's fine. I think if you lose sight of yourself, then it gets a bit scary. So I do, you know, I'm as capable of telling myself lies and deluding myself and all of that as anyone is. But I do just try, and I feel like the writing keeps me straight. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, I started writing a novel in January, and a lot of it is just enjoyable, and it wasn't for anything in particular. I just thought, let's just do some writing and see what comes out. You don't have to show it to anyone if you don't want to. And a lot of it is about all of this sort of thing. I've wanted to write an adventure story with a woman just at the heart of it, like a real rollicking adventure, you know, around the world sort of type stuff, but that is essentially at its heart about having an adventure with yourself, taking yourself on an adventure. And it just sort of led me to think about all that, the whole lockdown. Everyone's been thinking about all sorts of things on lockdown. It's not just me, but this sort of importance of happiness and adventure and excitement and curiosity and novelty are just such key things in living a good life. And I just think I can get a bit bogged down with stuff, with strategy and what's going on here and what's going on there and what's really happening and what's the behind the scenes and all of that sort of stuff. And I just sort of, I think now want to just go back to that golden thread that I had as a kid, that what's really going on, what's the big adventure, what's the story, what's the excitement, what's the truth. And I'm just sort of feeling quite excited about that in a kind of weird little, possibly mad because of lockdown way.
Well, I'm interested when I was thinking about the meaning of your work, because I think we first met, I might be wrong, but I remember doing a gig with you at a pub in Battersea. Probably over 15. I don't know how long ago was it you started. It would have been quite early on.
Yeah, 2003, 2004.
Yeah, I think it would have been about 2004, just over one of those bridges, and you know, and you went on. You had a tremendous gig, and then you had quite quickly, in my mind anyway. You know, you had some success on TV.
Yeah, it was.
And what I wonder is, was there a point where, because I see the person that I know now, obviously, I mean, there's a big change in your age, because you were very young then and all those things. Your playing age, of course, remains 25 to 35.
Of course, my
make that clear
age,
as well.
Press age 25. Yep.
Isn't it terrible that this vaccine has really given away how many people in showbiz have been lying about their age, hasn't it? But is there a point where you have realised the meaning of your work? Because it does seem like more and more, even if you're writing a book about, you know, someone might, it's just a book about Dirty Dancing. That is a book about an obsession. That is a book where you are going, let's have a look at this thing and what was it doing for me? Do you feel the function of your work has changed for you?
I feel the function is probably the same. I just think it's come more into focus and I'm more confident in it because I'm older and I'm just more confident in myself. You know, the sketch show really took off fast because essentially ITV and a couple of other channels were looking for celebrity-based spoof shows because they already had one or two going and Heat magazine was at its absolute peak. And I didn't know that. I just really was an avid reader of Heat and I found celebrities funny.
Does I sing like this? But I talk like this.
don't care. You what? I'm a pop star? God blimey, would you Adam and Eve it? That's fucking mental. I've only got one pair of shoes, and I eat with my hands. I ain't a diva, I ain't got a clue about nothing. Verse 2? What? Me? Now? I gotta sing verse 2? Bleeding hell. Alright then.
Every day I thank the Lord for what the Brits call torn.
And as I look back, a lot of the, I never did impressions. I was not good at impressions. I did these kind of approximations, but what I always described as what I was trying to establish was, what's the nub of Kate Winslet? Like, what's the essence of Kate Moss?
Who the hell are you?
You know, I used to be a lot like you, but then I started mixing vintage pieces with high street fashion, and the world was mine.
You what?
What's the kind of real, boil it right down essence of Angelina Jolie's, not even her personality, but her image, her PR appearance. So, that led to Kate Winslet just screaming about being normal to the point of insanity, and Kate Moss being a school disco bully who kind of kept all her gang in line by threatening to cut them out, So even though it was silly, I can look back and think, oh, actually, it was noisy and it was brash and crass and a bit hit and miss and all those things. But also there was something there as well of like, what are these people really doing? What's really going on here? What's the middle of this? Like, well, how can I get to it? And can I just get to it and then amplify it so massively it becomes ridiculous? Like that is sort of what was going on there through comedy, through really noisy comedy. And then the characters I wrote, like, that were just original characters, there was still some of that going on in there as well. So like, I had no control over myself. I had no craft, I don't think. I just was splurging stuff out that I thought and I felt. And I found live performance quite exhausting, and I backed away from it a bit. I do enjoy it sometimes, but I found it tiring. And a friend of mine who's a theatre director said, it's just you go off like a grenade on stage. Like, you don't have any sort of craft. You just go out like a bomb and sort of detonate, and it's good. Sometimes it's too much, but you're not controlling it. That's why you're tired. And I think the same was true of the writing. And I had less confidence in the writing because I had been sort of taught to be less confident in it by various issues on whatever, the industry and so on. But I think as I've grown more confident in writing, I have grown less interested in performing and more focused and more just like, no, I have a voice, I can use it, I can say this stuff, I can try to combine a big idea with a slightly trashy joke. Like, let's see if I can pull this off. That's where I like to be. And I just feel now like I'm 42. Maybe I'm finally learning how to do this. Maybe I'm finally learning how to control it. I interviewed Pat Barker for the Penguin podcast series, and it was such a standout interview for me anyway, even though I think by the time she reached me, she really couldn't bear to give another interview. I felt for her. But she just sort of said, really, you get the first draft down and that's a lot of fun, and then it's the craft. Rewriting is the craft. You have to learn that craft, and that's what I've learned over the last few years, and I think that is serving me at the moment anyway quite well. So I'm keen to learn more and control my impulses and my ideas better so that they're more focused and targeted, and I'm not exhausted all the time. So that's what I feel, I think. Just calmer and just more quietly, like, just get on with the work. You don't need to make a noise, just get on with the work.
Now, in a few weeks' time, we're going to be talking to Anil Seth about his new book, Being You. That's going to be on Book Shambles. But we already talked to him all about, well, things like objective truths. Do such things exist?
I tend to think of it, it is a struggle because, I think about this quite a lot. When you have an understanding of how things are, or a closer approximation, you're never going to get to the full story. How does that change your experience of those things? Does it undermine them? Does it devalue them? Or does it enrich them? And an easier example is something like color. You open your eyes and you see a world full of objects that have colors. It seems as though the colors are out there in the world, that they're real, that they're a real property of a physical world, that they would exist in a world without any minds. But we know that's not true. And this also doesn't take neuroscience. Newton pointed this out. Light is part of a spectrum. The brain creates colors from mixtures of wavelengths. The colors aren't there out in the world. We know this from artists. Cézanne said, Color is the place where the brain and the universe meet. So we can understand that color is a construction. When we know that people see colors differently. Some people saw that bloody dress as blue and black. Other people saw it as yellow and white.
In the cold light of day, there's no mistaking what color it is.
That was gold and that was white, definitely.
And what do you see this?
Well, I see blue and black.
They are the same dress. Sorry to tell you this.
It's definitely white with gold, definitely. And now it isn't. Something very strange is going on.
Lots of people thought the same.
Russians may see more shades of blue than non-Russians. But knowing this doesn't mean I don't experience color. I still experience color when I open. I can still enjoy color. It's still part of my world. I don't deny the richness of it. And I think the same goes. That same story runs through for all our experiences. So experiences of self, of being me, and experiences of free will. If I have a deeper insight into what underlies them, it doesn't make the experience go away or devalue it at all. It just means I can also see it from a different perspective. I think the trick to the balance we were talking about is to somehow hold in mind both of these perspectives. Right? That I will still experience myself as in control of my actions, of thinking about them, of deliberating, of regretting some of them, of being glad I did other things. I will still experience that, and I'm bound to experience that in just the same way that I will always still see things as being coloured, even though I know they aren't.
That was Anil Seth, and now here is one of my favourite authors. If you haven't read The Little Snake, you should read The Little Snake and all of her other books as well, including one about bullfighting, which is particularly intriguing. It's a non-fiction work. Anyway, here is A.L. Kennedy talking about the time that she found the voice that she writes with.
I think voice-based writers, music-based writers, that's kind of what we go for. I mean, as I say, I do not non-stop, but over 3 years, I do enough research that I will know the people. And I've also researched the setting, and it's like Pat Barker, yeah. It's like putting characters into a scene, and you kind of hope they're going to leave through that door. But the interesting thing, the research doesn't kill it. The research means that you know who is standing there and who is standing there and what they're most likely to do with each other, and that they will leave through that door. But if they leave through the other door, super cool, because if they've got agency, that's fantastic, because they're alive enough to have agency. But the beginning of a book is like when I'm saying, I've got the first sentence, it's you're waiting for something to say the first sentence, even if it's you're writing he, she. Actually, both of these threads in the current book are first person. So you really are waiting for somebody to turn up and say things in your ear. And I mean, I did one. The second novel was, I'd had the idea first, but I did a simpler novel first, because I knew I could do the second one, and it was about Cyrano de Bergerac coming back from the dead.
Ah non, c'est un peu court, jeune homme. On pouvait dire, oh Dieu, bien des choses en somme en variant le ton. Par exemple, tenez, agressif. Moi, monsieur, si j'avais un tel nez, il faudrait sur le champ que je me l'amputasse. Amical. Mais il doit tremper dans votre tasse. Pour boire, faites-vous fabriquer un...
Oh, that'll be great. I'll just go and learn 17th century French then. And I've got no money, and how do I even get in Paris? But it was magnificent, and it's Paris is easy to love, but oh my god, being in Paris with a guide, which is Cyrano's life, and going to the places where he went all of the morning, or being in the Bibliothèque Nationale, a period appropriate building, and at that point touching with no gloves on, my god, touching the manuscript pages that he's written with these incredible flourishes, because he's such kind of big guy. And then in the afternoon, I'd just mooch around, and I would always coincidentally happen upon a thing that was deeply to do with Cyrano. And it was just this magnificent process. But coming back from that, feeling really energized, and I think I found his gravestone, which nobody else has done. I'm still in my little tiny writing area, which was the space under the double bed on a platform in one of those tiny, tiny flats in Glasgow, yelling in French into midair, just needing him to turn up. And, I literally had his voice written down because he wrote these two magnificent, the two first science fiction novels of the world. So I literally had his voice rendered into really conversational, crazy French. It's just before the Academy kicked the shit out of all of the joy. So it's, I had his voice, but to get his voice for me, there's a lot of shouting.
When I first met David Baddiel, he actually wasn't interested in science at all. But in the last few years, he's become extremely interested, in particular in quantum theory, and he wrote a play called God's Dice. Anyway, we discussed whether God exists. Spoiler alert, David doesn't think he does, or she.
The desire for God, it does create that as well. It creates a community, it creates a culture, or whatever. I mean, as I say, I feel I have all those things without God because, it's quite unusual in a way. I hesitate to describe myself in any way as a celebrity atheist, but just for the sake of saying this thing I'm going to, if I'm one of those people, I can't think of, again, anyone else who's from an ethnic minority. I mean, Ricky isn't, you're not, and Dan Dennett, is that his name?
Yeah, Dan Dennett, yeah.
Most of those people, they're not. And so I have this slightly weird thing, which is in my own opinion, and I could be wrong here, this might be unfair, but like when I read The God Delusion, I thought, this bloke's not that much of an atheist, right? I think he describes himself as something like 7 out of 10 or something in some weird chart he does. And I think at some point he comes up with some weird bit of sophistry where he says, well, you can't actually prove the non-existence of something, so I accept that, blah, blah, blah.
You, I think, Richard, believe you have a disproof of God's existence.
No, I don't. You were wrong when you said that. I constructed in The God Delusion a 7-point scale, of which 1 was I know God exists, 7 was I know God doesn't exist, and I called myself a 6.
Well, why don't you call yourself an agnostic then?
I do, but I think it's a. I think it's.
You are described as the world's most famous atheist.
Well,
in
not
the book
by me.
Now, for me, there's a line in God's Dice where the celebrity atheist says. The woman says, I know God does not exist, like I know that stone is hard. That's then slightly subverted by the girl saying, well, stone isn't hard. Stone is only hard in terms of our sensations processed through the hand and whatever, because she's very clever. But basically, I'm with the atheist. I don't believe that God doesn't exist. I absolutely know that God doesn't exist. And that's, will sound sort of arrogant to people. At the same time, unlike some atheists, I feel that religion is not completely shit. I certainly feel that to dismiss religion, like Dawkins perhaps sometimes does, is to not understand what it means to be human. You have to give it the time of day and understand why people want religion and why they so continue to buy it and feel it's part of their identity. And essentially, I think of it as like I think of great literature or great storytelling or great music. To some extent, for people, that is what their identity is. And you can't just dismiss it. And I feel it a bit as a Jew. I feel all that stuff is in me as a Jew. And I can understand the power of it whilst totally knowing that the actual belief, the actual idea that I'm praying to someone is bollocks.
That was David Baddiel. Micahel Pollan has written some of my favourite books in the last few years. Many of you might have read The Omnivore's Dilemma or How to Change Your Mind. And his latest one is Your Mind on Plants. Or indeed, this is Your Mind on Plants. Anyway, we talked to him about the difficulty of investigating mystical experiences.
I think there are ways that it gets dismissed that probably feed it. And I think we have to be aware and careful in how we talk about these things, and respectful of people who do have faith and are spiritual in the supernatural sense. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about psychedelic science is it is a place where science and spirituality come together, and that there's a lot of talk about the mystical experience as the active principle in psychedelic therapy when it works. So there's a lot of research, more in America than in England, which I think is telling in itself, but that the people who are treated successfully by psychedelics, whether it's for their addiction or their fear of death, are people who have had a measurable mystical experience. And there's, 8 criteria for a mystical experience, and you can fill out a survey. And it's an idea that goes back to William James and the varieties of religious experience. And that kind of experience can be studied as a phenomenon, as a phenomenology, and scientists are studying it. And so it's not like these vocabularies are completely incommensurate, that once you're studying the mind, you have to study you can't measure it from outside, right? I mean, you finally need phenomenology, reports of what the experience is like. And some of those reports are going to be framed in a vocabulary that seems very unscientific, like mystical experience. But nevertheless, you can study it. You can study what occasions it. You can study what it's like for people and what it does for them, without making any judgments as to the veracity of what was experienced. You were talking earlier about, Blake and the angels in the room. And I was very troubled by this when I started reading about this, and interviewing people, that they had had experiences of seeing God or being in his presence, and I would say to the researchers, but aren't you feeding them an illusion? What if this treatment is based on convincing people there's life after death? Which, many people emerged from psychedelic treatment believing that there was more after, that your consciousness went somewhere. And it was interesting, the answers I got. Some of the researchers were like, well, that's beyond my pay grade. We don't know what happens after you die, which is, okay, true enough. Others are like, who cares if it works? Took a very pragmatic view, that if, that insight that there's something after death is not in the pill, that's in your head, right? I mean, there's nothing in the pill. There are no ideas, there's no images, there's no narrative in the pill. It's a catalyst for things in your mind. And if your mind takes you to a place that is helpful, even if it can't be independently verified, well, maybe that's good treatment. And I don't know the right answer to that question, but I think it's one of the challenges.
And finally, we ended this series with Natalie Haynes. How much have the classics influenced her day-to-day perception of life? Here she is.
I can't even separate them anymore, I don't think. I started doing Latin when I was 11, I think, or 12, and Greek at 14, which is really young. And so I was reading, Homer and Virgil for GCSE at 15, 16. And it's so long now that they've been in my life. So they've been in my life for 2/3 of my life. I would feel as lost without them, I think, as I would feel lost if people said, oh, you can't be funny now. You go, wait, what? And so, yeah, I find it really hard to imagine looking at the world without that sort of filter available to me. I find it really difficult to watch a movie and not be thinking of Aristotle's Poetics and the shape of narrative and all of those things. And I reckon there are loads of people who are doing that without having ever read Aristotle. Screenwriters and people who've done screenwriting courses are all using basically the same kind of thing that Aristotle talks about in the Poetics. They're probably just using a modern, iteration thereof, which may or may not mention Aristotle. And so, yeah, I think I find it really hard to imagine dealing with emotions without thinking about Greek tragedy. I find it really hard to imagine thinking about comedy without thinking about ancient comedy. I find it really hard to imagine thinking about almost anything cultural without classics being part of the way I frame it in my mind. And honestly, the same is often true of politics, the same is routinely true of social change or, sociocultural things. So yeah, it is so much a part of me. I find it very hard to imagine any other way of being.
I wonder about when I was talking to Sarah Parkak, who's an archaeologist, and she always says that the joy she has when she finds rude love poetry from 3,000-4,000 years ago, and very all of these hints that also this is a point where people were really bored in the temple and they were just playing jacks, and that's why there's that indentation. So people were still bored when they had to go to the services, they were still rude, they were still sexual. That does seem to, because I think when we're being brought up, we hear the word ancient, and that takes us back a few thousand years, which of course is not ancient in any way when you consider a 4.6 billion year old Earth, when you consider an enormous length of time of human existence before most things were recorded. Does that have an effect on you when you suddenly go, these roughly the same emotions and the same drives and the same ambitions were in the heads of people that we sometimes like to imagine as being far simpler than we were?
Always. There's a fantastic opening to Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where he says, things being as they are, people being as they are, this is a work of history not for now, but for all time, because people being the way that they are, they won't change. And he says his history is a possession for all time. He's quite certain that human nature is essentially unshifting, and I think that's probably not a bad thought to kind of set out with. Of course, it feels to us like everything changes incredibly quickly. That's because we're alive for a really short space of time, and so I think that I find it oddly more, perhaps most of all, with archaeological things. I can really see it where you see an object which has been physically held by someone, you can see the wear on it because their fingerprints have worn it down in a certain way. Or, Pompeii is a lovely example because of the graffiti that's scratched into the walls, and so much of it is mucky. And it's like, oh yeah, there are people. We're people. I once cried at Pompeii because you can see the tracks of wagons, where it's worn down the stones, and just the sense of bodies having moved over space with weighty things on wheels. Like, are you being emotional today? Yeah, I think so. I think it's fine. Don't worry, this is completely reasonable. So and every now and then you find a piece of poetry or prose from any time, I suppose, in the, as you say, not that ancient but ancient to most of us world, and it just feels like it sings out at you from that it could have been written just now. You're like, wait, what? And over again, I find when I track down a piece of Greek, usually now, that I feel that way about, but sometimes it's Latin. I'm like, what? You kind of, are you sure? It's like, is it definitely from? Okay, and I kind of go back to, I'm hunting down different versions of the Latin or the Greek online. It's like, but if I check, that's not just part of the translation. That's definitely there, and yeah, it is. So, yeah, it never quite fails to do that. To make me feel vaguely like this can't be what it is.
So that was Series 3 of Tips for Existence. Thank you very much to everyone who supported us via Patreon. That's how we can keep making these shows. Like I said, we're going to start again next week with Series 4 with Apollo 9's Rusty Schweickart. By the way, a good way of preparing for that is see if you can find online, if you go to his website, the speech that he made at Lindisfarne Festival in 1974. It's absolutely fantastic, and it will set you up for the rest of the episode. So thanks again. Thanks to our producer Trent Burton. And don't forget, if you're not already a Patreon supporter and you haven't heard any of these, as I said, there's 18 episodes as well as 12 episodes of An Uncanny Hour with Stuart Lee and Toya Wilcox and Mark Gatiss and loads more, plus lots of other extras. Then you can support us at patreon.com/Cosmic Shambles to hear lots of the things we do in their entirety. Thanks, bye-bye.